My book is an examination of the two dialogues written by Plato, which he devoted to a study of the sophist Protagoras. First in the dialogue named after the man, Protagoras, but also in another dialogue entitled Theaetetus. And what I tried to do in my book is to put together these two dialogues, these two portraits of Protagoras, this world-famous sophist, to see what it was that Plato wanted to teach us about this interesting man. And in general, I would say that the theme of my book is it's an examination of the engagement between Socrates and the life that he lived as a philosopher and a political philosopher in particular, as contrasted with this world-famous sophist, Protagoras. Where do they agree? Where do they disagree? And what are the most important questions or concerns that arise in this conversation between these two men? And the conversation proves to be something more like a confrontation. And there is a kind of polite clash between them, both in the Protagoras and in the Theaetetus. And so the theme of my book is the difference, the distinction between philosophy as Socrates lived it and sophistry as it's embodied by its most famous representative, Protagoras. This study is part of a broader inquiry or concern of mine into Socrates as a philosopher, as a figure, what it is that made him tick, and what insights about the world did Socrates have. And I noted in studying principally Plato's presentation of Socrates, that for the most part, we see Socrates engaged in conversations with young people. And those conversations, of course, are rich and engaging. But we never see Socrates as a mature philosopher engaged in a serious conversation with an equal. For example, Plato chose never to present himself and Socrates in a conversation, and they must have had hundreds, if not thousands, of such conversations. So for the most part, as I say, we get Socrates conversing with young people. The exception to that is Socrates' conversations with the sophists, with Hippias in a couple of dialogues, with Euthydemus, Dionysodorus, Gorgias, who strictly speaking is a rhetorician rather than a sophist, but a kind of close cousin. And it seemed to me that in these presentations of the conversations with sophists, and above all Protagoras, who I think everyone agrees is the most serious, most impressive of the sophists, we get Socrates engaged in a conversation with something like a peer. And the twofold presentation of Protagoras in the Protagoras and in the Theaetetus, I think, when you put them together, as my book tries to do, you get an exploration of fundamental moral, political, as well as theoretical questions. And it seemed to me that by studying Socrates in his differences from the best of the sophists, Protagoras, it's one way to begin to understand Socrates' peculiar approach to philosophy and to the world. And so in my book, I tried to flesh out the distinctive features of Protagoras' most serious thought, and to contrast that with Socrates. How does Socrates engage with him? How does he refute him if he refutes him, and so on? So the bulk of my study is an attempt to try to unearth, clarify Protagoras' teaching, his comprehensive teaching, and he has such a teaching, and then at least to begin to suggest how it is that Socrates differs from him and in what respects. And I could maybe spell that out a little bit in this way, that the Protagoras, it seems to me, the dialogue Protagoras, presents above all the sophists' moral and political teaching. The Theaetetus, by contrast, the theme of which is what is knowledge, presents his more theoretical stance about the world, what we can know and what we can't know. And to use a modern-day term, to link both of those teachings, the moral, political, and the theoretical, I would say that Protagoras was a relativist, an early and really quite radical relativist. Friedrich Nietzsche notes this in The Will to Power, that in many respects the relativism that is so characteristic of the modern or postmodern age had its roots in Protagoras. So in a way there's something very up-to-date in Protagoras. One of the challenges I found in studying these two dialogues is the fact that whatever else a sophist is, he prides himself on his capacity to speak well, which proves to mean cleverly. And Socrates, too, although he denies it, I think has to be considered a clever speaker. And so what you have is a kind of dance between these two very intelligent, very clever speakers, and neither is simply frank. Socrates is even famous for his irony. And one of the great pleasures, actually, in reading these dialogues is trying to figure out exactly where Protagoras stands, because he isn't simply frank. He prides himself on being more frank than the prior sophists, but still he too is cagey. Now, as far as his moral or political teaching goes, he anticipates Thomas Hobbes in some respects. For example, he denies that we are by nature political animals, the famous thesis of Aristotle's Politics. For Protagoras, that is simply not true. We are by nature isolated beings. And by nature, our condition is very harsh. There finally are no gods watching over us, according to Protagoras. In this, too, he's very much like Thomas Hobbes, who said that the state of nature is, our condition in the state of nature is nasty, poor, brutish, and short. So in many ways, Protagoras anticipates important strands of modern, even postmodern thought. And his moral teaching is that in this artificial community, which we call the political community, we have virtues that are literally or figuratively beaten into us, what he calls political virtue, that makes a community possible: piety, justice, and moderation. And he quietly indicates, Protagoras does, that these are not true virtues. They're not true excellences of character. They're qualities that the sheep must have in order to be good sheep. And what Protagoras offers as a traveling teacher, his students, is a kind of liberation from this merely conventional virtue, as he believes, and a praise of true virtue, what he calls wisdom together with courage. And so he separates out the virtues in these ways, the conventional and the true virtues. And so he has quite a radical political and moral teaching, which is, in this way, in some respects at least, hearkens to contemporary relativism. Now, the theoretical teaching in the Theaetetus is extraordinarily complex and so on. And I would just say this, that he toys in the Theaetetus with a very radical relativism that suggests not just a kind of moral relativism, which other pre-Socratic thinkers held to too, but the possibility that even the good is unknowable, and that what we can know about the world is very little or nothing, that the world is fundamentally in motion, constantly changing, in becoming rather than being, to use the language of the dialogue, and that all that we have is sense perception, what's given to us through the five senses, but that what generates that, behind this world given to each of us, is unknowable. But he even goes a step further, I think, and maintains that there is really no common world of sense perception to which we have access. And so his famous dictum, which appears in the Theaetetus, that a human being is the measure of the things that they are, and of the things that are not, that they are not. And that admits of a more or a less radical interpretation. But I think in Protagoras, it's true that he at least toyed with the more radical interpretation of that, according to which each individual is a kind of isolated perceiver. And he denies, therefore, a kind of commonality to which we have access. And so ultimately, his position in the Theaetetus, at least, as to what we can really know is remarkably limited. And one of the questions that I raise and try to answer in my book is why? Why alone of the pre-Socratic thinkers did he push this relativism, the limits of what we can know so far? And I think it's one of the most hidden or buried questions in the Theaetetus. But I believe, and I make the argument, that it has something to do with his awareness of the challenge of those who claim to know the world through the gods, through prophecy and the like, through a kind of revelation, to use a later term. And Protagoras was troubled by this. He was in a way impressed by the claim, and he tried to deal with it in his manner by having a recourse to this extreme relativism. Now, it's a long story how or if that's an adequate response. But in my book, I try to give what I hope is a comprehensive account, as Plato saw it, of Protagoras' teaching. Again, both the moral, the political side, which has many counterparts in modern political thought, and this more theoretical side, which is also relativistic but goes very, very far. And so when you put the two parts together, you have an impressive and troubling, I would say, doctrine. And Plato paid Protagoras a high compliment in devoting as much space to him as he did. Plato clearly presents Protagoras as a different being from Socrates. He presents him as a sophist. In fact, he boasts of being a sophist. He says, I'm the first person to present himself to the world as a sophist and to charge money for it. And he charged a lot of money for whatever it is that he did. According to him, there are lots of sophists around, but they always practice some other art, partly to conceal the fact that they were sophists, which is striking. Why conceal it? It's in fact a difficult question to answer as to just what a sophist is, and I'm not convinced that there's a clear modern equivalent. The simplest thing to say is that the root of the word is connected to wisdom, sophos. They have a certain wisdom, or they claim to have a certain wisdom. But the distinctive feature of the ancient sophist is that they were teachers for pay. In contrast to Socrates, who, as he says in the Apology, lived in 10,000-fold poverty. And it's generally said, and I think there's a lot to it, that they used their wisdom, their understanding, for the sake of gain, for the sake of pay. So a kind of prostitution of something high and noble for lower ends. And I do think there is something to that. So he lived in a very different way from Socrates, though he was concerned with broad theoretical and important questions. And I think it's probably a danger in reading Plato or other accounts of the Sophists to assume from the outset that there's nothing we can learn from them, even if ultimately they come in for heavy criticism, as Protagoras does in Plato. Socrates and Protagoras lock horns, and Socrates gets the better of it. I think there's no doubt about that. But still, there's something impressive about the man, even if he's a kind of flawed character. My hunch in the case of Protagoras is that he's a sophist rather than a philosopher, and understands himself to be a sophist rather than a philosopher, partly because he was a little too interested in money, perhaps, and pleasure. He's clearly a hedonist, as becomes gradually clear in the dialogues. But also I wonder whether he denied the thought that there is a wisdom available to us, that to the extent that we can know anything of the world, it's so limited, and that traveling from town to town as he does, meeting with the children of the elite, charging them extraordinary fees, teaching to some extent how to speak cleverly, which would promote a political career, and then with a few of his better students engaging in theoretical discussions. That was about the best life one could have, given how little we can know about the world, given how inhospitable by nature the world is to human beings, according to Protagoras. In thinking about a modern-day counterpart to the sophist, I hesitate to say it, but it could be to some extent a college professor, to some extent a lawyer, especially a criminal lawyer, an intellectual to some extent. The term intellectual to some extent captures the phenomenon of a sophist. But I would say that in the case of the best of the breed, and I would say Protagoras is that, so far as the historical record can tell us, he's all of that, but in a way more impressive than each of those taken it separately. That he really does have a kind of comprehensive teaching about the human place in the world and the world to the extent that it's given to us. And so it's tough to find an exact equivalent. Maybe the college professor who's a part-time lawyer would do. I don't know, something like that. As I've said, one of the things that interested me about these two dialogues, and the figure of Protagoras in particular, is as a kind of way into Socrates himself. And one of the ways that Socrates approaches the man is simply to ask questions, as Socrates is famous for doing. And what Socrates does, I think, in the Protagoras in particular, is to bring out for us to see a certain tension, a contradiction even, in Protagoras' own soul. And that's a long question, but briefly I would say this. Protagoras believes that he understands that justice is conventional merely, that like driving on the left or the right-hand side of the road, it makes no difference by nature. What goes by the name of justice, according to him, is what this given community says is right and wrong, but there's no foundation in nature for agreeing or disagreeing, and other communities will do it radically differently. This is mere convention by law or custom. And so he has no great respect for justice. Courage, however, is a virtue that he does admire. And it gradually becomes clear that while he laughs at the just who would sacrifice themselves in the name of justice, he has a lingering respect for the courageous who would sacrifice themselves, who would enter battle rather than flee from it. He admires courage. He thinks that he himself is courageous in going from town to town as a stranger and teaching these rather disturbing or unsettling doctrines. And Socrates, with patience and great care, brings out this inner contradiction in the soul of Protagoras. That on the one hand, he thinks in everything he's out for his own good, and yet that in a certain respect he admires those who sacrifice their good. And that tension, that contradiction in his soul, points to a problem with his broader understanding of things. And similarly, in the case of the Theaetetus, Socrates is particularly interested, I think, in showing the problem, the theoretical problem, that prompted or may have prompted Protagoras to adopt a most radical relativism. Now, in my view, Socrates did not adopt such a relativism. He was not a relativist at all. And so he must have had in his equipment bag a different response to that challenge, the challenge of those who claim to have supernatural knowledge. And so the two dialogues together are, I think, a very good way to begin to broaden one's study of the other Platonic dialogues. It's not the only way to proceed, but that's one way to proceed, I think. And to see how it is that Socrates himself engages in a conversation with those who hold to the moral virtues, in particular justice. Think of the place of the Republic in Plato's corpus and its great importance. And in particular, how Socrates engaged respectfully, thoughtfully, probingly with those who are open to the thought that there is a kind of supernatural wisdom or understanding. The Euthyphro would be the most directly relevant dialogue, and it happens to be in the sequence of the dialogues, the dramatic order of the dialogues. The Euthyphro is the sequel to the Theaetetus. So in the Theaetetus we have the question, what is knowledge? And much of that dialogue, not all of it, but much of it is devoted to Protagoras' answer. And then in the sequel to it, we see Socrates engaging respectfully and at some length with a representative, a kind of representative, of a knowledge that claims a supernatural, superhuman source.